Hello and welcome to Brave New Foundation's Rethink Afghanistan debate series. Today I'm joined by blogger and editor of theseminole.com, Jason Rosenbaum, and David Atkins, a political consultant and blogger at Daily Kos. Jason and David will be debating the question, will an expanded war in Afghanistan hurt President Obama's domestic agenda? Jason won our coin flip, so we'll start with you. You have 1 minute, Jason.
Barack Obama was elected to do a ton of incredibly ambitious things. He comes in the midst of a financial crisis. He comes in after perhaps the worst president in our history, and he pledges to reform major pieces of our country like education and healthcare and the way we get and use our energy. And he was elected on a platform of getting out of unnecessary wars like the war in Iraq. So Barack Obama has these huge ambitions, and this is where the public is on Afghanistan. Right now, only 49% are optimistic about the war. 34% are opposed to extra troops in Afghanistan, and 29% are actually against Barack Obama's plan. So if we've learned anything from our history, it's that presidents who go into unpopular wars are going to have problems with their domestic agenda. And I think Afghanistan is very close to being an unpopular war, and I think it will even get more so if escalation continues, and that's really going to hamper his sweeping domestic agenda, what he was elected to do, and what this country really needs.
All right, Jason, that's a minute. And David, please go ahead with your opening.
Yeah, there are three reasons why it's not going to hurt Obama's agenda. The first is that we're deficit spending anyway. All right, we have a $10 trillion debt. Currently, the war in Afghanistan has cost us about $439 billion. We escalate that, it's going to be a couple hundred to 300 billion above that before we win this thing, and that's not going to make a huge difference when we're talking a $10 trillion debt. And the cost of doing nothing, meanwhile, is enormous. Americans support, a majority of Americans support the mission in Afghanistan because they understand the stakes. The Taliban cannot be allowed to take back control of the country, which is what would happen in the power vacuum if we let that happen. Finally, Obama made a domestic promise. That was that he was going to end the war in Afghanistan by winning it while pulling troops out of Iraq. If he were to pull out of Afghanistan, we were to allow the Taliban and Al-Qaeda to take back control of that country, we would be in serious trouble politically as well and might lose the 2012 election.
Thank you very much, David. Jason, 1 minute to respond.
I would say that public support for Afghanistan, while right now it's at 55% believe that the war in Afghanistan is worth fighting, I think that support's honestly pretty soft. I don't think the American public have really had to examine whether it's worth the money and the blood for years now, since we went in after September 11th. I think if you look at what's happening on the ground right now, Afghanistan no longer crosses that threshold for warfare, and that would be an imminent security threat. At one point, Afghanistan was, but I think now I don't think it crosses that level. And I think once the public is actually forced to examine that, support really drops. And beyond the campaign promise, I think it's public support that's going to drive Obama's agenda in a very general sense. And if Obama loses support over an expensive and perceived as a war that's not worth fighting, I think he loses a lot of momentum for that domestic agenda, which frankly is much more important to me and I think most of America.
Thanks very much, Jason. David, your response to that, please.
We have to understand that Afghanistan is not Iraq. You leave Iraq, Iraq has a history of centralized government. There will not be a failed state power vacuum in leaving Iraq. That same cannot be true the same cannot be said of Afghanistan. The power vacuum after the Soviets left is what allowed the Taliban to rise to power in the first place. The Taliban are an unacceptable outcome. Taliban control of Afghanistan is simply an unacceptable outcome. For terrorist reasons, for human rights reasons, for a huge number of reasons. And the American people understand that. The American people will not be happy with a president who allows the Taliban to retake control of Afghanistan. That's why you have the public support that you have for it now. And yes, the war may become a little more unpopular if more coalition soldiers die, and that's as it should be. But I think the mission, the importance of the mission is very clear, and we will be back in Afghanistan if we let the Taliban take control of the country again, which is what will happen in the power vacuum of our leaving.
All right, thank you very much, David. Let's go to Jason, your 30-second summary, please.
I would say the fact that the Taliban would regain control, I don't think that's necessarily true, nor is it necessarily bad. There was a report released by the Carnegie Endowment that outlined how we could strategically keep ourselves safe, even with the Taliban in control. But beyond that, I think at some point we're going to have to choose between guns and butter. And I would hope we choose butter, because I think what Obama has going domestically is much more important than what may or may not happen in Afghanistan.
And David, your 30-second conclusion.
If the Taliban are allowed to be in control of Afghanistan, we may see terrorist attacks. We certainly will see horrific human rights abuses, and the consequences of a failed state in Afghanistan will be profound throughout the entire region. That simply cannot be allowed to happen. Meanwhile, the extra money we'll spend, $200–300 billion, is not going to make a big difference in Barack Obama's domestic agenda when we're talking about a $10 trillion debt, and he will take huge political damage for allowing that to take place if he does. That's why we need the escalation.
All right. Well, that does it for this first debate. Thank you very much to David Atkins and Jason Rosenbaum. If you'd like to learn more about this issue, please visit the website rethinkafghanistan.com. Thanks very much for joining us today. Tell us who won this debate. Vote at rethinkafghanistan.com.